Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Global Gurus, where every Friday we explore stories of international business and the people who make them happen. I'm Philip Auerbach of Auerbach International, your host, and today's guest is Thomas Fuller, whom I will introduce in a moment. Before we start, and as most of you know, we start each segment with a running segment called Faux Pas Fridays, where we present a funny mistranslation or blooper that does not quite convey the professional image that your company wants to present. And since today's guest is involved in the market research field, I thought it would be appropriate to give an example of how meanings in English can change when words or phrases are used incorrectly or in an incorrect word order. So an actual reason for an auto insurance accident stated in English: I was driving along the road when I looked over at my mother-in-law and hit a tree. So with that, today's guest is Tom Fuller. Tom is a 25-year veteran of the market research sector and is VP of Business Development at the firm Fluent Research in Manhattan. Tom has worked in 5 countries on 3 continents and has traveled extensively around the world. He's also served as interim CEO of a virtual reality multimedia park in Italy and as executive producer of Shopping America, a home shopping channel in the Republic of San Marino, which is one of the smallest countries in the world, totally surrounded by Italy. Welcome, Tom. It's delightful to have you with us.
Great to be here.
Thank you. So before we begin, perhaps you could plunge in and tell us a bit of your background and how you gained your international experience.
That makes it sound like I had a plan. I joined the Navy out of high school, and they trained me in electronics and cryptography. And that gave me enough technological experience to be of value to the market research community once I started working in that sector. And so, of course, my client base at the very beginning were multinational technology companies, and I started traveling as a result of that. And pretty much the winds of fortune blew me across the world. Again, I didn't have a plan, it just happened that way. I ended up owning my own company for about 9 years, and that I had offices in Shanghai and in the UK and in San Francisco. And that gave me the opportunity to visit a lot of countries as well as living in a few others.
And do you speak other languages or just English?
No, I'm fluent in Italian, barely functional in Spanish and French, and I can get around a little bit in Mandarin.
Excellent. And tell us about some of your experiences and I guess some of your most successful ventures as you've launched them abroad.
Well, the company I had of my own was fairly successful in China and in the UK. Didn't get much traction in the US, too much competition. There's about 30,000 companies in the US that have the same NIC code as we do. But we did well in China, hooking up with a mobile telecom operator and using them as a panel for market research purposes, and doing some work for the department for the education sector in the UK, and that was a lot of fun. My very first experience in market research was interesting, to say the least. We were evaluating an e-commerce website for a very large computer manufacturer, and it turned out that they were trying to roll out their first all-in-one product, a printer, fax, copier, and scanner, on their website. And at the end of the research, it became clear that their brand was so popular, they didn't really even need an e-commerce website. So I suggested to them that they put their brand new toy on a site that had just changed its name to eBay. And they did that, and it was a huge success. And they told me later that it got them $138 million in incremental revenues. And They bought
Wow,
me a very nice piece of glassware as a thank you.
that's great. And this was a market research company in the UK, did you say?
No, it was in the US at the time. It was in Silicon Valley.
Okay. And it's not your current company, it was another firm.
Oh, no. This was the very first market research company I worked with.
Right. Very interesting. You mentioned that you, I don't know if it was this first company you worked with, but the company was in China and the UK.
That was my company. I started I ran a company called Enquire Services for 9 years.
Huh. And there's a perception in the United States often that it's very tough to do business in China, and it takes a very long time because you have to cultivate relationships and build trust and so forth. So when you launched it, did you have immediate success, or did you have to build it up over many years?
It didn't take as long as you might have thought. We were in business for about 8 months before things started clicking for us. But after that, it went pretty well. But that was due more to luck and connections than any particular skill on my part.
Okay. And was there anything about doing business in China that was different in terms of, you can, for example, you can ask Americans certain questions that perhaps you couldn't ask the Chinese?
Yeah, there's a lot of difference in between the two cultures. In China, you pretty much have to be pretty patient and let things unfold at a different pace, at a pace set by the Chinese client as opposed to your own business needs. And if you can adapt to that and be patient with that, then it goes okay. But I found myself many times in front of a client who had basically become a billionaire without the help of market research. And pretty much the first question I was asked on more than one occasion was, I made $1 billion without market research. Can you really explain to me why I need you?
And how did you answer that?
Just, well, where is your next billion coming from?
That's a great answer. Right.
I didn't use that on the first one. That was the lesson I learned from the first time it happened.
That's great. When you say that just to let things unfold in China, in market research in the United States, there's normally some questions that the interviewer is asking, and you can either ask it in that order or skip around to elicit the answers that you're looking for, or the answers to the questions that you're looking for. Is it the same in China, or is it a totally different approach?
It depends on what kind of research you're conducting. Before, I was referring to actually business negotiations with prospective clients. When you're interviewing Chinese people, either business people or consumers, if you're doing a quantitative survey, you pretty much stick to an exact list of questions. But in qualitative research, like focus groups or in-depth interviews, then you pretty much have to structure things around the individual sensitivities of the people you're talking to. And that's not just culture specific. It's the same is true in almost any environment. But in China, there is a certain tendency to be more reserved and to keep certain sectors of questions off limits that wouldn't be in America.
And what kind of questions would you keep off limits in China?
There in America, in Western cultures, people will answer things on subject unless you're talking about their finances or their sex lives. In China, there, in addition to those, things about anything that's close to cultural or political sensitivities are pretty much off limits. And you have to kind of steer around whatever the sensitivities of the news of the day is. It's pretty much an autocratic culture. It's got a lot of censorship. I love the Chinese people. They're absolutely wonderful, but they're in an environment that encourages reserve, so to speak.
You said no questions about finances or sex lives, but in I know that certainly in Japan, and I think in other Asian cultures too, it is common, or it's at least appropriate, for people to state about finances. My rent is this, my salary is that, and it's more open than it would be in our country.
Yeah.
Is that the same? Is that true in China and elsewhere?
Not so much. The people who don't have a lot of money don't really want to admit it, and the people who do have a lot of money really don't want
to admit it, right? They want to keep it secret from the tax authorities and others. Yeah. Interesting. What about other countries that you've dealt with in terms of the interview approach and the market research approach? How would it be different?
When I was looking at your, watching some of your other podcasts, which are great, by the way, what really came to my mind was the cultural similarities between China and Italy. That for it's pretty logical, but they have a lot of things in common, culturally speaking, including sensitivity about finances, not so much about sex lives, but very careful about talking about money. They both seem in some ways sort of handicapped by the depth of their cultures and the long, rich history that they have in both places. There's just a lot in common between those two places. The emphasis on family, the somewhat pronounced distrust of government. That is the thing that struck me the most about all of my international experiences, was just when you're in China, you're reminded of Italy and vice versa.
That's fascinating. I've never heard anyone make that comparison before. That's really interesting. When you say handicapped by long history, how do you mean?
Well, for example, in the arts and in culture, they seem to not be moving forward as much, except in the last 5 or 6 years, it's changed, because it seemed like they might have felt that there was no point, because the classical arts and literature and plastic arts were so dramatic and wonderful that, how could you hope to equal like the poetry of Li Po or the art of Michelangelo or Raphael?
So is it more sort of replicating past masters?
Or being intimidated by them.
Oh, and therefore not creating new and vibrant forms?
Well, it's changing now, both in Italy and in China. It's in the process of changing, but there's this kind of gap where, English literature and French photography and all of that was really dynamic and going forward, where Italy and China kind of were at a standstill. And I think that was one of the reasons.
Fascinating. Yeah. In terms of research in other countries, how is that similar, or how is it different than in the US?
Recruiting people to participate is easier in China and more difficult in Italy than in the US. In China, it's because of a relative newness. What happens with market research is that the response rate declines over time. People are happy to participate in market research at the beginning of their online experience or the first time somebody calls them on the telephone. But after a few tries, they get a little bit bored with it and they're harder and harder to engage. In China, because of the relative newness of access to the internet and even mobile telephony, they are still more willing to participate than in the US. And in Italy, it was strong at the very beginning, but then it declined very quickly.
So that means you have to constantly look for a new source of interviewees, of participants.
That's true in every culture, but it's more pronounced, say, in the United States and in Italy.
Interesting. And does it depend on the subject, whether it's consumer or business or any specific subject?
It actually, the phenomenon is the same, although the rates are a little bit different. Business to business research, when you want to talk to a CEO, you're just going to have to pay a lot of money to get them to give you an hour of their time, and then maybe take them out to lunch and pick them up in a very nice car to take them to lunch. For the consumers, it depends on the subject matter, and if you're lucky and you're happy, you're doing research on a very hot topic, then it's not so difficult. If it's something obscure, then you really have to grind the sausage wheel pretty hard.
What about in other parts of Europe? How does that differ?
France is kind of similar to Italy. Germany is actually pretty easy. The Scandinavian countries, they're also pretty easy to deal with. The Benelux countries are a little bit harder, and then the southern, the southern med is a little bit difficult.
Okay, and what makes it different, or what makes it harder in these countries?
In Greece and in Spain, there's still a problem of a digital divide. A lot of the people that you want to talk to don't have access to the internet for online surveys, and they're not really happy about answering questions on the telephone.
Is it because they're non-trusting, or for another reason?
I think it's more that they don't want to spend the time. They actually have a life, and it doesn't include me.
And do you ever offer to pay people?
Always.
And they still won't, they still are reluctant to do it.
We probably don't pay enough, and that's on us. But if somebody, if a client wants to do a survey of 5,000 people in 6 different countries, they have a budget that includes how much you're going to pay for each respondent. Right. And that budget, in order to win the project, the budget has to be kind of low. And so you have to kind of really push to get enough people to respond in some countries.
Because of the nature of market research, is what you just said, that to get people to respond, and and I've got other reasons. Do you feel that the research is often accurate, or do you feel it's skewed?
If it is drawn up, that depends on the skill of the market researcher. If you draw up a questionnaire correctly, and if you make sure you are speaking to the right people, and you engage with them on terms that are comfortable for them, then yes. If the most common problem with market research is always not finding the right person to talk to. If you blow that, then you're out of luck. If you do a sloppy, quick survey that you didn't spend enough time on, if you don't have the right translators that have the cultural nuance correct in each different country, there's a lot of pitfalls. But if you do everything correctly, then yes, you can trust the results. Companies very similar to ours predict election results very well. They can tell what movie is going to be the most popular, what new video is going to be the rise to the top of the charts, and what Netflix should be doing next. So if you do it right, it works.
Very interesting. You mentioned not having the right translators. Yes, our language translation agency has translated surveys, mainly in this country, but of ethnic groups such as Chinese to English or Spanish to English or something like that.
Yeah.
When they fill in the blanks and and so forth. So yeah, that is very, very interesting too. And you're right that a slight nuance can skew the meaning.
Yeah.
If it's done right or done wrong.
Yeah, like in the Hispanic community, if you're doing a survey in Spain and also in Mexico, you're not going to have the same language in both of them. Right.
Yeah, and the different words, of course, have different meanings, and the nuances can be different.
Yeah.
Do you get involved with political research, your firm?
Rarely. We do an awful lot of socially relevant research for nonprofits and big associations. We do thought leadership work for organizations like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. So we do things that are affected by politics, but we don't do like political polling, like who do you like better in the next election? We don't do that.
I've received a lot of surveys in the mail and sometimes by phone, and I find that they're so despicably written in that they're totally skewed. What do you think of this, the ultra-liberal policy perpetuated by this party?
See, that's not market research, that's solicitation for donations.
Yeah, and of course it's made in the form of a survey.
Sure.
And very often when I get these political market research calls, I will tell them at the end, I've been involved in the market research fields for many years and in the marketing field, and your survey is 100% invalid because of the way that you phrase the questions. You're not asking questions that are soliciting neutral answers. You're obviously asking questions that are soliciting one point of view or a specific result. And therefore, when you publish this, it's totally misleading and it's totally wrong.
And it's push polling, and it's for a specific purpose, and it is as far away from market research as you can possibly get.
Yeah, and then people actually believe these results, which is worse. Yeah. What about other countries like in Southeast Asia or other parts of the world in which you've worked? Do the cultures affect then how people would respond?
To a certain extent, yes. But again, it comes back to the same pillars of doing successful market research internationally: finding the right respondent, having the right survey instrument, which means the properly translated questionnaire, and having the questionnaire constructed in a way that is most designed to engage the respondent. But that's different in every country. In Kuala Lumpur, if you're talking to Indonesians, you have to do things very, very differently, given not just, like Jakarta being in charge has had a certain impact on the outward look of people in Indonesia compared to prior administrations, but the economic situation has changed, which gives them a kind of a different viewpoint on a lot of the subjects. And you just have to be aware of those things when you start the research. Same is true in Malaysia, Vietnam.
Can you give examples of what you're referring to?
Well, I said Kuala Lumpur, and I meant Jakarta.
Malaysia.
Yeah. I went to Jakarta to supervise focus groups with Indonesians. And it was about consumer electronics goods. And in preparing the survey, I had to get there a little bit early and make dramatic revisions to the focus group topic guide, because so many consumer electronics items had been introduced just in the past 2 or 3 years. And so people were still overly influenced by the newness of technology that they were experiencing. So I had to really adjust the topic guide for the focus groups to reflect that. And it basically turned a 90-minute focus group into about 2.5 hours.
Wow. Are these overseas sessions interpreted automatically for you?
Usually, what happens is they're obviously recorded, then transcribed, then translated, but also in the back room where I'm watching the focus group, there is a dual interpreter that listens to them and basically gives me a running commentary. It isn't word for word, but it tells me what they're saying, so that if I have a question for the moderator of the focus group, I can put it on a piece of paper and send it into the room. Or if I want them to delve into a subject more deeply, I can just get the message in and have it go on that way. It's not perfect, but it works.
Yeah. And of course, people are answering in their native languages, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Very fascinating. Are there any some difficulties with the actual translation that you're getting, that perhaps it's the question is misunderstood, or the wrong words are used, or the wrong concepts or something? and it's just a totally different meaning than what you expect?
Not so much. The real problem that we find with translation, and we've experimented with a number of different translation agencies, and I've done a lot of experimenting over the 26 years I've been doing this, is there are translation agencies that start by doing machine translation, that is basically speech to text, and then they try to edit over the top of it. Right. And that does not go well normally. I hate to say it, but to do a good translation, you need a person that is listening to the recording and translating it word for word. And much as I love Google and what they do, speech to text isn't quite there yet.
Right. Well, the rule is that if you do use machine translation, which is the proper word for software translation like Google Translate, you must have a human editor who speaks the native language, and of course in this case would speak fluent English, and who understands, and who is, in our case, has a master's degree in the art of translation, and who speaks the subject of whatever the session is about, so that the person understands the nuances and the concepts and so forth.
And that works, that works if the human editor is as qualified as you described and has the time to actually do the job. Obviously, given deadline pressures and budgets that affect translation companies, they can't always deliver on that ideal.
Right, and that's another reason why the research may be less than valid.
That's true.
Yeah. I think you've said that you've worked in Taiwan as well. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Are there differences between China and Taiwan in terms of, I know you can't, in China, you can't deal with political topics, of course, but are there other cultural differences between the two countries?
Yes, there are, which kind of is surprising given the closeness of the two cultures. Obviously, Taiwan is more open and more willing to discuss subjects that might be almost taboo in mainland China. But there is also a sort of a personal reserve. They are, the Taiwanese, again, they are wonderful, wonderful people. But they tend to be a little bit more reserved and conservative. The Chinese, the mainland Chinese in the big cities are kind of ebullient and are experiencing this new, economic growth and getting these exciting jobs and new startups and all of that. Taiwan, I think you'd almost say they were more comfortable with sort of a 1950s attitude towards job security, taking care of business, getting married, having kids, and doing things in a more traditional fashion. So those are the main differences that I know.
Well, I think the mainlanders are also interested in, marriage and kids and.
Oh yeah, if they can afford it.
They can afford it, yes. But you're saying, well, let's use the word nouveau riche, because the mainlanders are nouveau riche, newly acquired, and money is, again, fairly new to their culture, as opposed to the longer 70-year history of Taiwan, for example. Then that skews how people look at things.
I think so, yes.
Yes, very interesting. What about, again, are there other similarities or differences with other countries that you've dealt with?
Well, let's see. I find the UK to be about as different from America as it is possible for another English-speaking country to be. The famous quote is that England and America are divided by a common language.
Right.
And I don't know, I don't think the differences are linguistic, but I do find the English to be very different to Americans in a lot of important ways. I think that the English are more, well, I don't want to say cynical, but skeptical. They are more pragmatic. They tend to be very calm until they're not. And then when they cross that line, you just kind of want to stand out of the way. Americans fly off the handle really quickly, but then seem to recover their equilibrium just as quickly. And on the whole, I find the English to be, I hate to say this, and it's a gross exaggeration, they seem to be smarter.
Interesting. Do you think they're better educated in that way or just more aware?
Probably. Now, this is directly related to my job specialty, where I deal with fairly senior people that have a university education, which in England really means very, very smart. In America, it just means you went to a college and got a degree. So that probably influences my opinion.
Very interesting. So are you talking about senior executives or are you talking about consumers?
Well, on a business, in terms of the relationships I had, they were business relationships, basically.
So this is B2B research, right?
Yeah, no. This is my clients trying to get people to do business with, or my clients or my prospects. They were all senior people in established companies. The people I was conducting research with ranged from consumer in both countries, ranged from consumers to business owners to like IT administrators and companies with more than 5,000 employees, et cetera, et cetera. And my experience is that saying somebody's educated in England has more worth than saying somebody's educated in America.
Right. The degrees mean more.
Yeah.
And when you say, you've said the English, do you mean the British, including the Scots and the Welsh and the Northern Irish, or do you just mean the English?
No, pretty much all of the above. There are some wicked smart people in Scotland, and some of the smartest people I ever met were from Wales.
Wow. So you mean the British, not just the English?
Right.
Yeah, very fascinating. Is there ever, have you encountered differences in the way that words are used in between British and American English? And
there's lots of them. And, I think back to the movie Love Actually, where they're laughing about just the differences in pronunciation, but there are wild differences in meaning as well. There are vocabulary differences, but there are words, that, you say in American English that would get a stare in England, and vice versa. Boy, now you're going to ask me for examples, and I'm going to struggle to think of one.
No, that's okay. Have you come across any, comical issues in any other country, culturally or linguistically or anything?
Well, actually, I heard something similar on a recent podcast that you did, but I'm going to say it anyway. I was invited to a family dinner in Italy, and I was new to the country, didn't speak Italian. I was visiting my brother's girlfriend's family, and it was, they sat me down and they brought out a plate of pasta, and it was wonderful, of course, and I ate it, and they said, "Wow, you must be hungry. Do you want some more?" So, yeah, I'm hungry, sure. And that was just the prelude to a 4-hour meal that had like 8 different courses. And I was full of pasta by the time they came out with the second course. And of course, to be polite, you just keep eating and eating and eating. And boy, I didn't sleep that night.
That's funny. But it wasn't a matter of wine. It was just a matter of pasta.
Yeah.
That's very good. Is there anything else you'd like to add or to clarify?
One thing given what's going on in the world today with war and inflation and all of that, my experience traveling internationally is, and you've heard me say it a couple of times during this interview, is how nice people are. And I have found that to be true everywhere I go, is that people are nice, decent human beings. And it's just, I hope we don't forget that.
Yeah, that's very true. I found the same thing, that ultimately at the core, people are nice and friendly and decent and helpful. and kind and considerate, and especially if you're foreign in their country, then they may go out of their way to help you a bit more.
In Taiwan, if you are foolish enough to open a map, you will attract a horde of Taiwanese people trying to help you get to where you want to go. They will walk you to your destination.
That's great. I've heard that in other countries too. That's really wonderful. Yeah, I've done that when I see foreigners on the street in my city in the United States. I always go up and help them, and sometimes they're delighted, and sometimes I wouldn't say offended, but I would think, I'm looking at my phone to figure this out for myself. I don't need your help.
Yeah.
And it's probably an age difference or something, of wanting to be helpful and relying on your technology. So, well, Tom Fuller, thank you so much. I really appreciate your wonderful insights and your help and your great expertise in the international market research field.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. This has been Philip Auerbach of Auerbach International. Our website is auerbach-intl.com. And I hope you will join us next Friday for another edition of Global Gurus and their stories of international business. Thank you.